You've written your results now, so what in the world are you going to discuss? Now, many of my students struggle on this, and a strong discussion section can take a pass level submission to a merit and a merit to a distinction. So let's demystify this today. Hi, I'm Ken and I teach research at two UK universities, and I run a business guiding Masters and PhD students on research. In this video, we'll look at what discussion sections are, what purposes they serve, how they fit within your research, and how do you write a strong discussion section. So let's get started. When you started your research, you began with a review of the literature. You possibly mentioned about how important it was, the research gap, about why you wanted to do this piece of research, what you wanted to achieve, and how you're going to achieve all of that. Now, you did your research. You have your research findings and your readers have already seen what you have found. Your discussions is your way of closing that loop, not only to explain the findings that you have, but also to situate your study within the available research. If your research gap is a missing puzzle piece, then your discussions is you putting that puzzle piece back into the puzzle. Tell your reader about this puzzle piece that is your research. What do the findings mean? How does your study fit within the wider research? And what does this study and its conclusions mean for other people reading your study? There are a few things that are important to your discussions. These are key elements scattered throughout your study, and you will see how they all marry and connect with each other in your discussions. Firstly, your literature review, specifically the theoretical frameworks that you're using and other related research around your topic. Rationale and research gaps, specifically the ones that you are trying to fill. Your aims and objectives, naturally. Your research methods, specifically what went well and what went wrong during your research. Your findings, specifically what are the most important and meaningful observations in your research. Essentially, you need everything because that is how connected the discussions is within the entire document. A strong discussions chapter generally cover a range of elements. Some are going to be more relevant to your research than others. Firstly, explain your research findings. Why do your stats look like that? Why are international students more likely to struggle with mental health stigma? Why do elderly patients find it more difficult to access digital health apps? Why did you make these observations about your data? Bring in literature to explain the possible relationships or observations that you're establishing. It is very likely that you're going to have to look outside the field to explain this because that is the gap that you're trying to fill in the first place. So look to adjacent fields and tap into other disciplines like the social sciences, healthcare, education. Do not research in a vacuum or within an echo chamber. Secondly, answer your research question and explain how you have achieved the aims and objectives of the research. This is probably one of the most important part of your research. How your study achieves its aims and objectives is not always clear, and especially if this is a dissertation or thesis where your aims and objectives were presented 2 or 3 chapters ago. In your discussions, it is often helpful to remind the reader of your intended objectives and how you have achieved them. Connect your research to other literature and theories. Beyond explaining your own findings, connecting your research to other people's research is important because it creates value for your study. This is where your literature review, your research gap all come in. This time, think about how your research helped explain other people's research. How does it fill the research gap? How does it connect with other studies around that gap? Think about the theoretical connections of your research findings as well. Does it add anything to the theories that we know? Does it point out flaws in theories? Does it contradict theories that are in use at the moment? Connect your research to the wider context. Remember, in your literature review and your background, you probably discuss broader and further elements like the UN sustainability goals or NHS guidelines or health policy, social inequities, current social political climate to establish the importance of this study. Now it's your turn to close that loop. Show the readers how your research findings may have influenced the wider context. Does your findings suggest something about policy? Does it raise further issues and barriers to healthcare access? What does your research mean about future educational practices? Get your research out of ivory tower scholarship and show how it can have impact in the real world. Implications and recommendations for stakeholders. Implications and recommendations are difficult to take apart. Implication refers to how your research can impact the stakeholders, while recommendations refer to what they should do. There are 2 different things, but they're not disconnected. In your literature review, you may have suggested how your research may be important to doctors, policymakers, patients, students, leaders, government. So now tell these people what they need to take home from your research findings and tell them how they should act, what they should do in light of your research. Future research recommendations. Now, research recommendations are specifically for researchers and also sometimes people who fund research as well. In doing your research, you may have uncovered some further research gaps or the next steps of your research. Research breeds more research. While your research may have developed out of someone else's further research recommendations or identified research gap, other people's research may grow out of yours as well. If you have further research ambitions, this is where you can think about positioning your own future research proposals or PhD applications. Limitations. Limitations refer to the limitations of your research study, not the generic limitations of your research methods. At a degree level, generic limitations like small sample size for qualitative research may work, but at the master's and PhD level, this does not reflect a critical understanding of research methods. So look deeper into your own research specifically. What did you struggle with in your study? What happened in your study? Did you choose a specific theory to narrow your analysis? Did you struggle to recruit a certain participant demographic? Were there certain necessary assumptions made in your research? Your limitations needs to specifically relate to your research and should not be something that comes right out of a textbook. Strengths. Balance out your limitations with your strengths as well. Please don't forget about this, because one of the worst things for a reader is to spend so much time reading about your research and then get to the end where you tear down the entire study and it looks like they have wasted their time reading about your study. As much as there are things that went wrong within your study, you need to uphold the integrity and the value of your study. So show what was well done in your study. Why is your study still valuable? Again, this should not be generic and should only be relevant to your study specifically. If you've learned something from this video, give it a like and subscribe for more content about research and free templates to help you along with your study. Writing your discussions in a structured way is the most straightforward thing to do. Your introductions will be quite similar to your other introduction sections. You might want to remind the reader of the research aims and objectives and the key findings of the study from the previous chapter. The main body of the discussions should be written in topics, and this will cover elements 1 to 4. Explaining your research findings, link to research aims and objectives, and to wider literature and context. The best way to decide what topics to cover is to start with the key findings. First, take a step back from your research study and ask yourself this: if I need to summarize my findings into only 3 bullet points, what are the 3 bullet points? These would then become your discussion topics to cover. Think about the narrative, the story you want the reader to know and what you have found out. Implications and recommendations will then come next. This will be written according to the stakeholders, so maybe you would like to discuss the implications and recommendations for patients first and then for professionals next. Your research recommendations will then come in last. Strengths and limitations is the last section, but this is also sometimes written with the conclusions chapter as well. Check with your tutor or your supervisor. This can also be up to preference and the way your writing flows as well. A conclusion for the discussion chapter can sometimes tie up the discussions very nicely, especially if your discussions chapter is long or the logic of your discussions is quite convoluted. In a master's dissertation, a conclusion is sometimes skipped because the next chapter is a conclusions chapter, and your discussions chapters are typically shorter and less complex. I think generally a short conclusion section can still be helpful just to visually close up the chapter. In some types of research studies, you may have other things to add to discussions depending on your research objectives. Some of you may have mentioned developing guidelines or frameworks, or designing a curriculum, or developing a theory or a model. These would then go into the main body or the recommendations of the discussion section, depending. Writing discussions can be very tricky because there is no formula like your methods chapter. I've provided you with some considerations of what needs to be in a discussion, but how it looks like at the end would depend on your study and the objectives that you are presented. Now, if you're looking at discussions, you might be interested in getting as much out of your dissertation as possible. In this video over here, I cover how you can benefit professionally from your dissertation and how you can set yourself up for further research opportunities. I will see you in the next video. Goodbye!